بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another in our series on Al-Qawa'id Al-Fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxims. Today's maxim is another subsidiary of the major maxim Al-Adatu Muhakkama, which means custom is an arbiter. Today's maxim is لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان. Evolution of Sharia rulings based on custom and ijtihad due to changing times is not to be denied. Okay, so this is apparently a very broad statement, and the intent is more limited, especially when you look at just the Arabic text. The limitation has been added, extra words have been added here in the English in order to prevent misunderstanding. Now, with regard to the Sharia rules, they're of two major types. There are thawabit, things that don't change, and there are mutaghayyirat, things which do change. So the thawabit, of course, the belief system is the same today as it was in the time of the Prophet ﷺ and in the time of the prophets before. So the beliefs don't change. And there are certain rules that are also fixed. And the component of the Sharia that's fixed will be based primarily on texts which are thabit and explicit. So there are two dimensions these texts have. They're very authentic, and the meaning is explicit. There's no ambiguity about the intent of the statement. So when rules are based on these kinds of texts, then they don't change. There are other texts, and actually with regard to fiqh rules, the scholars of usul and the scholars of fiqh mention that the majority of fiqh issues are dhanniya as opposed to qat'iyya. Qat'iyya means there's just no two ways about it. It's only one way. Dhanniya means that there is a certain amount of speculative reasoning that was used in order to arrive at the ruling. And why is that? Because the texts themselves sometimes are open to more than one interpretation, because wordings are of three levels according to the classification scheme of the majority of scholars of usul al-fiqh. There's wording that is nas, which means there's just no two ways to understand it. The classical example of that is with regard to fasting. If you didn't have an animal to sacrifice during the Hajj, you're making Hajj tamattu and you don't have an animal to sacrifice, and then you fast 3 days during the Hajj, 7 days when you've returned, 10 days in all. So how are you going to understand that in two ways? 3 plus 7 equals 10. So that's an example of a nas, a text which is explicit. There's only one way to understand it. The majority of texts will have some angle by which there is some ambiguity built in. There is a dominant meaning, but there are other possible interpretations which are not completely excluded. And then there are certain texts where the text, it's not clear enough to act upon by just looking at that text itself. And those are then texts which require explanation from other texts. Now, that third category, which is called mujmal, most of those texts have the explanation. It's rare to find a text where it's like, there's still some ambiguity after the explanation. One of the examples of that is with the categories of riba. The hadith that mentions 6 categories. Gold for gold should be exchanged like for like, and hand to hand, meaning immediate exchange. Silver for silver should be exchanged like for like, immediate exchange. And the same for dates, wheat, barley, salt. So the vast majority of scholars agree that there are other commodities to which these prohibitions would also apply, and then they disagree about what those other categories are based upon identifying an effective cause that's present in the categories that are mentioned. So that kind of a text, there's still ambiguity after all that the scholars have looked at those texts. They disagree about the implications of the text. So you have fundamental rulings established by explicit texts, explicit authentic texts that don't change. You have other rulings which are established by texts which are not quite as clear-cut. Then you have rulings where there's a text, but the parameters are left to custom. So this is what we've been talking about in the last few episodes. When a ruling has one of its bases in custom, and the custom changes, then that ruling will change as the basis for it changes. There's another kind of change that might occur from one circumstance to another when the effective cause for the ruling was present in a given situation and it's not present in another situation. We'll come to some examples of that in order to clarify what that means. If we look at the terms that are used in the maxim, ahkam means rules. It's the plural of the word hukum. The scholars' definition, the technical definition of a Shariah hukum is khitabullah al-muta'alliqu بأفعال المكلفين بالاقتضاء أو التخيير أو الوضع. So what this means in English is communication from the lawgiver concerning the conduct of the mukallaf. Mukallaf is a person who is responsible for his actions. And this communication may be in the form of a demand, which is iqtida, or an option, which is takhyir, or it could be an enactment. So what do these terms mean? Iqtida, a demand, would be that the lawgiver wants you to do this action or wants you to abstain from it. So if that demand is a strict demand to do it, then it's wajib. If it's a strict demand to abstain from it, it's haram. If it's not such a strict demand to do it, then it's considered recommended, mandub. And if it's not such a strict demand to abstain from it, then it's considered makruh, dislike. And then takhyir, the second element of this definition, means that you're given a choice. It's a neutral choice, and that's the category that's called mubah. Now, al-wad is this other thing. It's another category. It's a type of Sharia hukum which serves this first two categories, which is the request and the choice. Wad means assignment. So what it means is that in order to recognize when a given Sharia rule will apply in a real situation, the lawgiver has set up certain markers. Okay, when you see this, that means it's a trigger. This ruling comes into effect. Okay, but in order for that trigger cause to have its effect, certain conditions have to be fulfilled, and impediments must be absent. So we've referred to these three concepts of the trigger event, the cause, which is known as sabab, the shart, which is the condition, and the mani', which is the impediment. We've talked about these in passing or in detail in other episodes. Now, if the sabab of a ruling is present in one situation, absent in another, then the rule doesn't apply when the sabab is absent. Let's take a break and we'll pick up in a minute or two.
Al-Aziz, the Almighty. Al-Wadud, the All-Loving. At-Tawwab, the Acceptor of your return. Al-Razzaq, the Provider. Al-Raqib, the All-Watchful. وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. To Allah belongs the beautiful names. فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. So call Him upon them. To understand more of Allah's beautiful names, join me, your brother Majid Mahmood, on my new series about understanding Allah's beautiful names on Peace TV.
الله لا إله إلا هو له الأسماء الحسنى.
Don't miss the chance to comprehend the seamless explanation of Allah's beautiful names in Understanding Allah's Beautiful Names. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. and repeat telecast at 12 p.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV. Dialogue. Discussion. Debate. Rebuttal. Conclusion.
Eliminate misconceptions about religion. Get enlightened.
Witness Dr. Zakir Naik in a battle of words in Crossfire. Next on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. So we're talking about this principle, this legal maxim, that it is undeniable that certain kinds of Sharia rulings change as times change. And let's look at some of the evidence for the principle. In Surah Al-Anfal, Allah says, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu harrid al-mu'minina 'ala al-qital, in yakum minkum 'ishruna as-sabiruna yaghlibu mi'atayn, wa in yakum minkum mi'atun yaghlibu alfan min alladhina kafaru, bi'annahum qawmun la yafqahun." That's verse 65. Verse 66 goes on to say, "Al-ana khaffafa Allahu 'ankum, wa 'alima anna fikum da'afa, فإن يكن منكم مئة صابرة يغلب مئتين وإن يكن منكم ألف يغلب ألفين بإذن الله والله مع الصابرين." The Prophet ﷺ is being told, urge the believers to fight. If there are 20 of you who are steadfast, they will overcome 200. And if there are steadfast 100 of you, they will overcome 1,000 of the disbelievers, for they are people who do not comprehend. What is it that they don't comprehend? I mean, يَعْرِفُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. They may know the affairs of the apparent way that the world works very well, but they don't understand the hidden system of Allah. And if Muslims are in tune with that system, then they have the hidden help of Allah. So the next verse says, "Now Allah has lightened your burden, knowing that there's weakness in you. A steadfast 100 of you will defeat 200, and a steadfast 1,000 of you will overcome 2,000 by Allah's permission. Allah is with the steadfast." Now, this passage, both verses are phrased in terms that make them look like statements of fact. If there's 20 steadfast, they will overcome 200 of the enemy. And then later says, if there's a steadfast 100 of you, they will defeat 200. So it looks like a statement of fact, but there's a clue here that indicates that this is not a statement of fact, it's an order. Because Allah says in the second verse, He knows that there's weakness in you, and He has lessened the burden for you. So in the first verse, if you're facing 10-to-1 odds, then the Muslims, based upon that verse, they were not allowed to retreat from the battle if that was the odds against them. After the rule had been lightened, they're not allowed to retreat if the odds are 2-to-1 against them. But if they're 10-to-1, they are allowed to retreat. That's the dominant interpretation of what this passage is saying. And in the tafsirs about this verse, you see that, in the first verse it mentions 20 versus 200, and then that's the lower proportion. And in the second verse it's mentioning 100 versus 200. And so the scholars of tafsir, they mention that this is a hint or an allusion to the fact that at the time of the first verse, the numbers of the Muslims in general were not very many, and that by the time of the second verse, their numbers had increased. So at the time of the Battle of Badr, for instance, the Prophet ﷺ, he made dua to Allah. He said that if this group is defeated today and exterminated, there will be nobody left who worships you alone on the face of the earth. So for them to be steadfast under those conditions where they were facing 3-to-1 odds, it was crucial that they do so. Now, in discussing this verse with my colleagues, one of my learned colleagues, he was of the opinion, this verse, the original verse that was quoted here, has not necessarily been totally abrogated, in the sense that Muslims in a given country, in a given situation, they may be facing those kinds of odds where they're not being helped by the rest of the Muslims, which is a common, unfortunate feature of our current situation. And so the demands of their situation may require that they actually remain steadfast against odds that are more than 2-to-1. That's a point of juristic difference. The majority opinion is that the earlier verse has been abrogated. There's an important matter from the Sunnah that's relevant to this. One year the Prophet ﷺ announced, if anybody slaughters a sacrificial animal among you, none of the meat should remain in his house at the end of 3 days. The next year the companions asked, Messenger of Allah, shall we do as we did last year? He replied, you can eat it, give part of it to people, and store part of it. Last year people were experiencing hunger, so I wanted you to help them. So the prohibition of storing meat in the first year was due to the circumstances in which that order was issued. There was a drought, and there were people that had come into the city of Medina from the surrounding desert, so it was imperative to extend hospitality to them. And so by the second year the situation had changed, so the rule changed. And so this is an example on an usul al-fiqh principle related to this. It says, al-hukmu yaduru ma'illatihi wujudan wa adaman. Application of the rule hinges on the presence or the absence of its effective cause. And in a similar issue, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور فزوروها فإن في زيارتها تذكرة. I had prohibited you from visiting graves. You may now visit them, for visiting them is a reminder of the hereafter. So the original prohibition was due to certain beliefs and customs of the pagan Arabs associated with visiting graves. And after time, the new Muslims had become more firmly established in their understanding of Islam. So the fear of them lapsing into those pre-Islamic customs had dissipated, and so the reason for that original prohibition had disappeared, and the prohibition disappeared. Another interesting example is that in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, if somebody committed manslaughter, he accidentally killed somebody, the compensation for that was 100 camels to be given to the family of the victim. After the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Islam had expanded outside of the Arabian Peninsula. People living in a city like Basra or Damascus, they probably didn't have much need for camels. So in that time, Umar radiallahu anh, he was the ruler, he realized, some people don't have camels, period, and the recipients may not have any particular need for them. And it would be much more convenient for people who were living in cities to pay the diya in gold or silver. And so there was one place where their dominant currency was silver, and so he fixed the diya based upon the value of camels at 12,000 dirhams, and in another place where their dominant form of money was gold, then he fixed it at 1,000 dinars. And he also made provisions for owners of sheep to pay in sheep, and owners of cows to pay in cows, and producers of garments to pay in garments. Now, another example from the Sunnah was that when the verse was revealed prohibiting alcohol, the Prophet ﷺ also prohibited the Muslims from using certain containers. Why? Because these containers were used to brew alcohol. And then after it became clear that the Muslims really had given up, this habit had gotten out of their system, so to speak, then the Prophet ﷺ, he allowed them to use those containers again because they were no longer liable to trigger the longing for alcohol that they would likely have triggered immediately after the prohibition. Another example, that in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he was asked about animals that are lost in the desert. And he said, for a sheep, if you find a sheep, you should take it and look for its owner, because if you don't take it, the wolf will probably take it. And so somebody asked him about, well, what about camels? And his face turned red, he got angry. And he said, what do you have to do with it? It's got its food and its water on its back. So, in other words, the camel will survive in the desert no matter what. So it's not your camel, leave it alone until its owner finds it. But in the time of Uthman, people's level of piety had decreased a bit, and there was noticed, the scholars explaining the policy of Uthman interpreted in this way, that there were some people who were taking these lost camels. So the official policy of the state under Uthman became that if a lost camel was found, people were told, bring it in to a government location, and it will be corralled until its owner comes to claim it. And another example of that during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, if somebody brought like cloth to a tailor and left it with a tailor, and if some damage occurred to that cloth while it was with the craftsman, anything like that, materials given to a craftsman in order to do some work. So the craftsman was considered a trustee, so he was not liable for damage to those materials unless it was proven that he had transgressed or been negligent. But after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people began to notice that, again, the level of piety declined, and so it became a policy that no scholar disagreed with, that if a customer brought a claim against a craftsman, said, I gave him this material, it got damaged in his presence while it was with him, he should compensate me. So the default ruling then became that the craftsman would have to pay compensation in those cases unless he could prove that somehow it wasn't his fault. An example that's relevant to Islamic finance is that of agency. The Prophet ﷺ, he would sometimes point somebody to do something on his behalf, and those people would do those acts voluntarily. After the time of the Prophet ﷺ, if you want somebody to do something on your behalf, maybe you can find a friend who'll do it for you, probably your family member would do it for you, but sometimes you can't find a family member or a friend who'll do it for you. So you need somebody who will do that act on your behalf, and they won't do it without payment. So agency for payment became something that scholars acknowledged that, yeah, it's valid to request payment for that kind of a thing because you're offering a service to your principal. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you for attending. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wallahu a'lam.